In this video, I'm going to be showing you how to create a roll-in Juno style synth stab that's going to sound like this. And inside of Ableton, I went ahead and loaded up a copy of the Massive X synthesizer. And inside of Massive, I went ahead and had it on the initialized Massive X preset. And that's the main preset that has all of the internal routings by default. You want to make sure that you don't load up the Massive X blank preset, or else it won't have all of these additional routings, which I like to use because it saves me a little bit of time. In order to get this more analog style synth sound, we're going to be making use of some of the analog drifting features that are available through some of the modulation routing. Analog drift is the effect of the two oscillators of a synthesizer, or however many oscillators you have loaded up, slightly moving back and forth in pitch. The pitch on vintage synthesizers tends not to stay exactly constant because they're in fact analog circuits. So we're going to be simulating this effect inside of Massive. So first, let's go ahead and go over to our wavetable section and change the oscillator type to square sine saw under basics. And then we want to go ahead and change that over to the saw waveform. So turn that all the way up so we get a nice saw waveform. And then we want to move the pitch down to -12. So that way we have a lower note. And then we also want to move over to our second oscillator and turn that on at full volume and change that to the saw waveform as well. Then we also want to go over to the pitch section and turn that down to -12 so that we have both of these oscillators operating in unison. And then I actually want to turn this down just a little bit to 0.030. So that way these two oscillators are slightly out of pitch so that they'll phase off one another. So you can hear that phasing between the two oscillators. And that's what we want because we're recreating a vintage style synthesizer that has sort of that analog drift. Then we can move over to the amplifier envelope and make the sound a little bit more like a pad. So go over to the attack and put that just under halfway so that our sound fades in. And then we'll bring up that release slightly to just over halfway. And then we'll turn down the sustain to about 75% or so. And then so far that sounds like this. And then over in the noise section of the synthesizer, we want to add just a touch of white noise to simulate the noisy circuitry that you sometimes have on vintage synthesizers. And we just want a little bit of this noise. You don't want to overdo the white noise on this or else it'll sound like you have a white noise layered on top of everything. What we're going after is just a little bit of hiss in the oscillators, so that way it sounds a little bit more analog. So that would be too much. We can just bring that down. Just about there or so. And you'll probably have to do this by ear. You just want a little bit of that noise layered on top of the oscillators. Next, we can go down to our routing section. And what I want to do is take the noise oscillator and route that around our filter section. So this way, once we start applying some filtering to our sound a bit later, the white noise is still layered on top of everything and we don't cut out any of those high frequencies. Because this specific white noise is being used more as an effect to model sort of noisy analog circuitry. Now let's get the oscillators inside of our synthesizer to sound like they're drifting even more. So to simulate this, we're going to be using the VR modulation section. VR stands for voice randomization, and this is the modulation mode that's all the way to the right of the synthesizer. So we can go ahead and click on this, and then we want to apply this to wavetable 1 pitch, and also the pitch of wavetable 2. So on the first oscillator, turn this down to -16. So that way we just have a little bit of this random modulation happening. And then we want to go over to our second oscillator and turn that up to 0.25. So what the voice randomization mode is doing is just introducing some random modulation to the pitch of our synthesizer's oscillators. So the first oscillator is moving down in pitch slightly, and the other oscillator is moving up in pitch slightly. And this will happen randomly, which will simulate that analog drifting that you have on vintage synthesizers. So far it sounds like this. So it almost gives it a natural chorusing effect. Next, let's go ahead and modulate oscillator 2 even further to make this effect more pronounced. To do so, we're going to be using one of the switcher LFOs inside of the synthesizer. So go down to the LFO number 4, make sure that is set to the free mode, so it just sort of cycles freely. And then we want to bring that rate down slightly so that the rate is a little bit slower. And then we want to change this over to a sine wave so that we have a smooth modulation. And then we can apply that to the pitch of oscillator 2. So with this modulation, I want to do two separate things. The first of which is I want to just modulate the signal's pitch just a little bit. So move this down to -0.07. It's a very, very slight modulation. And then the main thing that I'm wanting to do here is I want to scale the modulation of the voice randomization mode by using this LFO. So to do that, you just click on this little green circle and move that over to the right so that the right half is filled up all the way. So the voice randomization will be increasing in value as the LFO is cycling back. This will add some further variation between the two oscillators and will increase the sort of analog drifting that we have. So all of these little changes that we did to the pitch of the two oscillators is what gives us that really nice natural chorusing style effect. Next, let's create some additional movement by adding in a modulated filter. For this, we're going to be using the Blue Monarch filter because it models an analog style filter. This is the filter type from the Monarch synthesizer that Native Instruments also makes that I'm a big fan of. It's an emulation of the filter found on the Moog synthesizers. So it's a really fat analog style filter, which will sound great on this type of patch. So the first thing we want to do is just bump that resonance just a little bit. And not too much, probably about 2 to 3% or so. And then we want to take the filter cutoff frequency and bring that almost all the way down and keep the amount at maybe just about 10%. The next thing that we want to do is take the gain and go ahead and overdrive that and turn that all the way up. This will take the entire synthesizer patch that we have so far and it will overdrive it into this analog style filter, adding distortion and harmonics to the sound, which will really help fatten things up. The next thing we want to do is go ahead and move over here and turn down the volume. We also want to add some width and fatness to our sound, so let's go into our voicings tab, and we'll use the unison mode to add several different voices of unison. So go ahead and turn that on, and then we can keep all these different sections at their default state. So we have 3 voices of unison happening at kind of a medium stereo width. And I can just take this filter up slightly just so you can kind of hear what's going on. So this is what it sounds like. And this would be without it. So it's not quite as wide or lush sounding. So with it, we really fill out our synth sound. So for now, we can just go ahead and turn down this filter, and we'll be modulating that here momentarily. So now let's work on that filter modulation. So we'll go back down to our envelopes, and we'll use envelope number 2 as a filter modulation. So we'll go ahead and assign that to our filter, and turn that amount up till just about there, so it's even on both sides. So it's probably to about 90% or so on that filter. So that way the synthesizer patch really opens up whenever we have this filter modulation happening. And then we also want to go down to the filter, increase the attack slightly to just under halfway. We can leave the decay where it's at by default. I want to take the sustain and put that up to about, say 75% or so, basically, so it's just pointing at the end of sustain here. And then we also want to take the release and bring that all the way up. So once we release the key on our keyboard, the filter doesn't automatically close. So that sounds like this. So that filter is what gives the synth its interesting tonality. You can also bring down the resonance just a little bit as well. It's a little bit too loud. And then finally, we can go ahead and add some effects. So for this, what I want to do is add in a chorusy sounding reverb. So it's kind of a blend between a chorus effect and a reverb. So we give our synth patch a sense of space, but then we also give it this nice sort of stereo width and phasing that you have on a lot of these classic 80s style synth sounds. So let's go over to our effects section. We can turn that on and go down to the reverb. And then we want to leave it on the reflective mode, which is its default state. You've got all of these different reverb modes you can choose from. But for now, we'll just go ahead and leave it on the reflective mode. We'll bring the mix down. We'll bring the size all the way up so we have a really long sounding reverb. And then we want to bring the color down slightly. And what this will do is cut out some of those high frequencies, giving us a little bit darker of a sound. And then we want to take the chorus and turn that all the way up. So that way we introduce some nice phasing and stereo width to our signal. And so far, the finished sound sounds like this. So now that the synthesizer patch is finished, I can show you those notes that we have in the introduction. It'll give you a little bit of an idea of how you can use the synthesizer in a song potentially. So we'll just go ahead and close out our synthesizer. And then I can open up these notes. And looking at this note sequence, basically what this is an ascending and descending pattern. It starts off on this G note, which is the root note for this quick melodic section. And then we jump up an octave to another G in the 3rd octave. And what makes this interesting is we're kind of jumping between these 2 different octaves. And then we jump down to this D sharp, jump up to a C note, we jump down to an A sharp, and then back down to that G. So it's just ascending through the different notes of the scale. And then we have sort of the same pattern repeated, but with slightly varied notes. So this time it starts again on the G, and then it goes up to an A sharp, which is another note that we used in this previous section. And then it jumps back up to this G note, and then plays the same sort of ascending pattern, but this time in reverse, and then jumps back down to the G, which is the root note. And altogether, that sounds like this. So that's all for this video on creating a classic Roland Juno style sound in Massive X. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you in the next video.